Give up, black girl. You can't fight me. Officer Brett Calloway's forearm came down like something that had been waiting all morning for a reason to land crushing against Maya Donovan's throat as he dragged her backward across the courthouse steps in downtown Atlanta. His voice low and close to her ear, the way a man speaks when he wants only one person to hear how much contempt he carries. It was a Tuesday in October, and the steps of the Fulton County Courthouse were doing what courthouse steps always do in the early morning, collecting people who had nowhere else to be and nothing left to lose, people clutching manila envelopes and trying to look smaller than their problems, people who had learned that the building behind those doors did not always mean what it said about justice. Maya had been standing near the third column from the left when she noticed the older woman crying. Her name was Odessa Grant, and she was wearing a grocery store uniform, the kind with a name tag still pinned to the breast pocket even though she clearly wasn't working. Just a woman who had come straight from a night shift to this cold stone entrance because she needed to speak to someone inside about her family, and had been turned away at the door without explanation, without eye contact, without the smallest courtesy that the situation deserved. Maya was 24 years old and carried the kind of appearance that made people underestimate her before she opened her mouth. Round wire-rimmed glasses, slightly too large for her face, a navy blue blazer worn soft at the elbows from too many library hours, a canvas bag heavy with constitutional law textbooks, and a coffee thermos with a hairline crack she kept forgetting to replace. She looked like someone who had gotten lost on the way to a study group and wandered into the wrong building entirely. She was not lost. She had been at the courthouse to drop off clinic paperwork, and she had been 5 minutes from leaving when she heard Odessa crying and stopped the way people stop when something in them recognizes a sound they cannot walk past. Maya did not shout. She did not record. She simply walked over and asked in the polite and careful tone she had been trained to use when speaking to people in distress, whether the woman needed help understanding her options because there were visiting rights procedures and there were legal aid contacts, and she happened to know both. That was when Brett Calloway noticed her. He was posted near the main entrance, broad-shouldered blonde hair cropped tight under his cap badge, polished to the kind of brightness that required deliberate effort. The sort of officer who had learned early that standing still with your arms folded conveyed more authority than any sentence you might speak. He was 38 years old and had spent 12 of those years building a specific kind of reputation, not for excellence, not for service, but for the particular talent of making people feel that their next move would be a mistake. He did not ask Maya who she was. He did not ask what she was doing. He walked toward her with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who had never once been told his pace was wrong. And when she turned to acknowledge him with a question forming on her lips, his hand was already on her wrist. "You're interfering with an official matter," he said, and the words were barely out before his arm came up and around, locking against the front of her throat from behind his grip, tightening with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed this exact movement in this exact way before, not in training, but in use. Maya's hands came up instantly, fingers clawing at the hard muscle of his forearm, while her lungs registered the pressure before her mind had fully caught up to what was happening. Odessa cried out. A man somewhere behind the growing crowd said something nervous and unintelligible. A woman near the bottom of the steps took out her phone, filmed for 3 seconds, then lowered it. Nobody stepped forward. Because Brett Calloway wore a badge and Maya Donovan was just another frightened black woman pinned beneath the weight of everything the badge had always been allowed to mean. The pressure around Maya's throat did not ease. It increased degree by degree the way temperature rises in a room with no windows gradually and then all at once. "I wasn't doing anything," she gasped, her voice scraped thin by the forearm across her airway, her fingers working desperately against his wrist without finding purchase. I was only... You were interfering," Calloway said again, not loudly, almost pleasantly, the way someone recites something they have memorized and no longer need to think about. Odessa. Grant took one trembling step toward them, her voice breaking open. "Officer, please. She didn't do nothing. She was just trying to help me." Calloway pointed at her without loosening his grip or turning his head, a single gesture that contained every threat he needed to make. "You move again, you're next." Fear swept visibly across Odessa's face, and she went still, hands pressed together at her chest like a woman in prayer who had stopped believing prayer would be enough. The crowd on the courthouse steps had grown without anyone announcing it, the way crowds always form around something people know they shouldn't watch, but cannot make themselves leave. Someone held a phone up for 4 seconds, then lowered it when a courthouse security officer nearby began scanning faces. A man in a business suit looked at his own shoes. A young woman near the marble pillar pressed her lips together and turned slightly sideways, not leaving but no longer quite present. Maya heard Calloway begin to read charges: assault on an officer resisting interfering with police business, in the same even detached voice, while his arm stayed locked across her throat, and she understood with a clarity that cut through the panic that the charges were not being read because they were true. They were being read because once they were spoken aloud, they became the first draft of a story, and whoever wrote the first draft got to decide what the story was about. She whispered, "I can't breathe." Not for the crowd, not for the cameras, simply because it was accurate, because her lungs were telling her something urgent that she needed her mouth to confirm. Calloway kicked her phone with one sharp motion of his boot, and it spun across the stone and cracked against the base of a marble pillar. "Now nobody's recording," he said without any particular satisfaction, just as a fact, the way a person notes that a problem has been handled. Then his free hand reached toward the handcuffs on his belt. Maya felt the cold certainty of it move through her like water, finding the lowest point in a room. If the cuffs went on while she was half-conscious, while his version of events was already in the air, the story would be finished before she drew her next full breath, and she would spend the next year trying to correct a sentence that had already been believed. She stopped pulling at his arm. That was the first thing, the stillness that came not from surrender, but from something that had been trained into her body over 9 years of early mornings on cold mat floors. Something that knew panic was the enemy of geometry, and that geometry was the only thing that ever actually worked against a larger, heavier, angrier person who thought size was the same as power. Maya's mind narrowed down to 3 points of contact: his wrist against her collarbone, his hip angled behind her left side, his weight shifted forward and slightly overcommitted because he had never once had someone not struggle at this point, and the absence of struggle had thrown off his calibration by just enough. Her chin dropped. Her right hand closed around the meat of his forearm, not pulling outward but pressing it down and inward, creating the sliver of space against her windpipe that let a thread of air through, thin as a needle but enough. Her left knee bent slightly, foot finding the texture of the stone through the thin sole of her flat shoe. She felt the weight of her own body like a tool she was picking up and deciding how to use. Calloway grunted. "Quit moving." She pivoted, not explosively, not with anger, not the way movie fights happen with sounds designed to make people flinch. She pivoted the way water redirects itself around an obstacle, using the forward pressure of his own lean to make his momentum work against him, stepping across his stance, dropping her weight exactly where his balance was already compromised. His body went over her hip. The sound of him hitting the courthouse steps was dense and final and loud enough that the entire crowd went silent in the same half-second, the particular silence of people who have just seen something. Their brains need an extra moment to process, because it did not happen in the order they expected. Calloway's handcuffs clattered away from his fingers and skidded across the stone. Maya followed the motion downward, with him controlling his wrist with both hands before he could reach for his weapon or recover his position, shifting her weight just enough over his shoulder to hold the pin, not injuring, not escalating, just stopping. Then she released him. She released him completely and stepped backward, both hands open and raised where everyone could see them, her breath coming in ragged, painful pulls that sounded worse than they felt, because her throat was still raw from what had been done to it. "I'm not attacking you." she said loudly enough for the crowd, her voice rough and broken at the edges. I defended myself. He was choking me. He tried to cuff me without telling me I was under arrest. Everyone here saw it. For a long moment, nothing happened. Calloway pushed himself upright slowly, his face the deep red of a man whose humiliation was metabolizing into something more dangerous than the original anger had been. He stood on the courthouse steps of downtown Atlanta in his pressed uniform, with his polished badge and his years of accumulated authority, and he looked at Maya Donovan, 24 years old, wire-rimmed glasses, slightly askew canvas bag still somehow on her shoulder, and the look in his eyes was worse than anything he had said. Several deputies converged from different angles, none of them moving toward Calloway, all of them moving toward Maya as though she were the source of the disturbance and he were simply the location where the disturbance had occurred. Maya bent carefully and picked up her phone from near the pillar where it had landed. The screen was cracked straight across. Notifications were already arriving. Someone had already posted something. She could see it in the number climbing in the corner of the screen, but she couldn't read the caption yet from this angle, and some part of her already knew it wouldn't begin where the story actually began. She gathered the pages of her constitutional law textbook that had scattered across the steps, her hands moving slowly and deliberately, and on one of the wet pages in the gray morning light, the words "unlawful restraint" sat at the top of a paragraph she had been studying for an exam she now couldn't remember the date of. She did not read them. She just held the page for one moment too long before folding it with the rest. By the time Maya reached her apartment, the version of events that Brett Calloway needed the world to believe was already fully formed and moving through the internet with the confidence of something that had never expected to be questioned. The caption read, "Law Student Attacks Officer Outside Fulton County Courthouse." The video began the exact moment Calloway's body hit the stone, not a second before. Maya's apartment was on the 4th floor of a building where the elevator worked 3 days out of 5, and the hallway smelled permanently of someone else's cooking. The kind of apartment that looked to anyone who visited like a person who was surviving on ambition and not much else, with thrift store furniture arranged around a desk that took up a third of the room and a stack of bills living under a mug that read, "Future Attorney" in letters that had started to fade. She locked the door twice. In the bathroom mirror, she saw it clearly for the first time. A dark crescent of bruising had begun forming beneath her jaw on the left side, with a pressure line running along the curve of her throat where the forearm had sat, and smaller marks near the side of her neck where the grip had concentrated. She leaned closer, tilting her head slowly under the light, and her breath stopped. Not from fear, but from recognition. The way you recognize something you have seen before in a different context, something your brain has filed carefully without telling you why. She went to her laptop not to search her own name, which she knew better than to do yet, but to finish the research she had been working on before the courthouse, because there was a citation she needed for a clinic brief that was due Thursday, and habits were sometimes the only thing that kept the floor solid. The file she had open was on a case she had been assigned through the Civil Rights Clinic, a wrongful death matter, 3 years old, never fully adjudicated, handed to her with the note background research, only this one's cold, written in her supervisor's handwriting on the folder tab. The name on the file was Terrence Grant. She had been halfway through the autopsy summary when she left for the courthouse that morning. Now she opened it again and found the line she had marked with a small pencil notation, contusions along left lateral neck, crescent-shaped bruising beneath mandible compression pattern consistent with sustained forearm restraint. Maya sat very still. She reached up and touched her own neck. She scrolled to the officer response section. Subject resisted arrest, became combative during lawful restraint, suffered apparent medical distress. Body camera unavailable due to equipment malfunction. Traffic camera footage not retained. Witness statements inconsistent. And at the bottom of the page in the line designated for the primary responding officer, Brett Calloway. The apartment lost all sound. Maya sat in the particular silence of someone who has just understood that what happened to her today was not a bad day. It was a pattern. It was the same arm in the same position, leaving the same mark on a different person, except that Terrence Grant had not had 9 years of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and a partially working phone and a crowd of silent witnesses who at least stayed long enough to see the ending. Her phone rang. The screen said, "Mama." Maya looked at the autopsy photo. She looked at her own reflection in the darkened window. She let the phone ring once more, and then she answered it. The morning after arrived the way bad mornings do not, with noise but with accumulation notifications stacking up in the dark. Before Maya was fully awake, the phone screen lighting the ceiling of her apartment at 6 a.m., with the particular cold glow of a world that had already decided something about her before she had the chance to dress. 11 missed calls, 43 unread messages, an email from the dean's office with the subject line, "Urgent Conduct Review. Please respond immediately." And below it, an email from her internship supervisor written in the careful, over-formal language of someone who needed to distance themselves without appearing to take sides pending clarification of yesterday's incident. "We believe it is best to pause all clinic-facing activities until the matter has been resolved through appropriate channels." Maya read the word pause and understood exactly what it meant because she had spent enough time in law school studying how institutions moved to know that pause was the polite architecture of punishment. It required no evidence, admitted no wrongdoing, and placed the full burden of proof on the person who had already been hurt. Camille Okafor called at 7:15 before Maya had finished her coffee, and Camille's voice carried the particular alertness of someone who had not slept because they had been working instead. Camille was 28 and had the kind of mind that treated injustice as a research problem. She approached it the way a scientist approaches an anomaly, not with outrage, but with the quiet, relentless need to understand what caused it and what it connects to. She had found 2 longer videos of the courthouse incident before they were buried under the wave of the edited clip, but both began too late to show the chokehold. She had also found the complaints. 3 of them filed against Calloway over 6 years excessive force racial slurs during a traffic stop unlawful detention of a minor, all of them reviewed and closed by the same signature Sergeant Dale Merritt. Maya wrote the name on the inside cover of her notebook. She circled it once. She pulled up Terrence Grant's file again in the morning light and read it more slowly than she had the night before, the way you read something when you already suspect what it will tell you, and you need to be absolutely sure before you allow yourself to believe it. Terrence had been 34 years old. He worked warehouse loading 12-hour night shifts. He had a daughter in elementary school and a mother who called him every evening at 8:30, regardless of whether either of them had anything particular to say. The official summary described a man who had become combative during a routine stop. The autopsy described a man who had bruising consistent with sustained restraint compression. What the autopsy did not explain, and what Maya noticed only because she had spent months studying restraint injury patterns for the clinic, was that the compression marks extended in a direction inconsistent with voluntary struggle. They were the marks of someone who could not move, someone who was already restrained when the pressure was applied. Terrence Grant had been in handcuffs. Maya set the file down and sat with that for a long moment, her coffee cooling beside her. The city outside her window doing what cities do in the morning, moving indifferent, carrying its millions of small dramas forward without pausing for any single one of them. She thought about Odessa Grant standing on the courthouse steps in a grocery store uniform, with her name tag still pinned to her chest, crying and asking to be let in, and the fact that Odessa Grant had been trying to get access to someone connected to her son's case, and Maya had not known that. Yesterday had not known any of it, had simply stopped because a woman was crying and it seemed like the right thing to do. She placed the autopsy photograph of Terrence's neck beside the photo she had taken of her own bruising the night before, held both up to the window light side by side, and looked at the shape of what Brett Calloway left behind. The crescent was the same. The position was the same. The pressure line followed the same trajectory on both necks on 2 different people in 2 different years, telling the same story to anyone willing to read it. The house on the west side of Atlanta was modest and deliberate, carefully trimmed hedges, clean windows, a small angel statue beside the front steps, a faded American flag hanging still in the October warmth, a child's bicycle on its side in the cracked driveway as though someone had just set it down and gone inside for a moment and would be right back. Maya and Camille sat in Camille's old Honda for a minute before getting out. Not because they were unsure, but because some places carry a weight you want to acknowledge before you walk into it. "What if she doesn't want to talk?" Maya asked. "Then we leave," Camille said. "But she called you 3 times last night after she saw the video. She knows who you are." Odessa Grant answered on the second knock. She was a small woman in her early 60s with silver threading through hair pulled back into a careful bun, reading glasses hanging from a chain at her chest, wearing a lavender cardigan despite the afternoon warmth, the kind of cardigan a person puts on when they need the small comfort of familiar fabric. Her eyes went first to Camille, then to Maya, and then stopped at the scarf wrapped around Maya's neck, and something in her face shifted that was not quite recognition and not quite grief, but something that lived in the space between them, the place where a person realizes they have seen a particular shape of harm before. "You're the girl from the video," Odessa said. "Yes, ma'am." Maya kept her voice soft. "My name is Maya Donovan. I'm very sorry to bother you." Odessa did not move aside yet. She studied Maya the way people study something they have been waiting 3 years to see without knowing exactly what form it would take. "Reporters came after Terrence died," she said. "They took pictures of my porch and my face and my flowers and they called it coverage. Then they left." "I'm not here for a story," Maya said. "I'm here because Officer Brett Calloway put his arm around my neck yesterday, and when I looked at my injuries last night I found your son's file." Odessa's hand tightened around the door frame. The tendons in her wrist went visible. Camille spoke gently. "Mrs. Grant, we can leave if you'd prefer. Right now, no questions asked." Odessa looked at the scarf again. "Take that off," she said quietly. Maya hesitated for only a second, then unwrapped it slowly. The bruise had deepened overnight, purple and green beneath her jaw, the crescent shape vivid in the afternoon light, the pressure line clear as a sentence written in the language of force. Odessa covered her mouth with one hand. She stood that way for a long moment, not crying, not speaking, just standing at the threshold of her own door, looking at the mark on a young woman's neck with the recognition of someone who has seen that particular geometry in a photograph she has looked at more times than she can count. Then she stepped aside and opened the door wider. The living room was full of Terrence photographs on every surface. The kind of accumulation that happens when you cannot bear to put someone away and cannot bear to look at too much of them at once, so you spread them thin across the space you share with their absence. Terrence in a Falcons jersey. Terrence holding a small girl on his shoulders, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. Terrence standing with Odessa at a church picnic, his arm around her shoulders wearing a work shirt, with his name stitched above the pocket in red thread. On the side table near the lamp sat a framed photograph with a black ribbon pinned around its corner. "That was 2 Sundays before they killed him," Odessa said, following Maya's eyes. They sat Maya on the edge of the couch, Camille quiet beside her, and Odessa began to talk in the controlled voice of a woman who had told this story so many times to people who ultimately did nothing that she had learned to strip it of the tremor, to deliver it like a report. Because the tremor cost her energy. She had stopped being willing to spend on people who weren't going to use what she told them. 3 witnesses had given statements after Terrence died. A cashier at the gas station nearby, a ride-share driver who had been parked at the curb, a man who sometimes slept behind the laundromat half a block away. 2 changed their stories within a week. The third disappeared from the address on file. Every complaint Odessa had filed, 6 of them addressed directly to Sergeant Dale Merritt, had been returned with the same stamps. Case closed. Insufficient evidence. Officer conduct within departmental policy. Then she went to the cabinet beside the television and came back with a shoebox worn at the corners from being taken out and put back too many times and set it on the coffee table between them. Inside letters in envelopes, handwritten notes on yellow legal pads with names circled and dates underlined, phone records, complaint receipts, photographs. And at the bottom of the box, wrapped carefully in a piece of tissue paper, a photograph which Odessa held against her chest for a moment before passing it to Maya with both hands, the way you pass something that is both precious and unbearable. Maya looked down at the photograph and felt her stomach go cold and still. The bruising on Terence Grant's neck was nearly identical to hers. The same crescent beneath the jaw, the same line of pressure along the airway, the same concentration of force in the same location, and his wrists, visible at the edge of the frame, carried the deep circumferential bruising of handcuff restraint. There were no defensive marks on his arms, no torn clothing, no scraped palms. The wrists of a man who could not have fought back because he was already bound. Odessa's voice broke for the first time. They told me my boy resisted. But Darnell Terrence was handcuffed when that man's arm went around his neck. Maya could not look away from the photograph. "Sorry, don't open graves, baby," Odessa said quietly, steadying herself. "But you walked out breathing. My son didn't. So tell me what you came here to ask." Maya set the photograph down on her knee. Her throat still burned when she swallowed. "I need to know who helped bury the truth," she said. Odessa reached under the coffee table and pulled the shoebox a few inches closer. "I've been waiting 3 years," she said, "for somebody to ask that question." Brett Calloway sat in his patrol car in the parking lot of a sandwich place 2 blocks from the precinct and ate a turkey club without tasting it, watching the same 3 seconds of traffic pass through the intersection ahead without really registering any of it, thinking not about what he had done, but about what she had done, which was the specific way his mind had always sorted these situations, by locating the source of the disruption in someone else's behavior and working backward from there. He was not worried. That was the honest truth of it, and he knew himself well enough to know the difference between suppressing worry and simply not feeling it, and right now he was not suppressing anything. He was irritated. There was a difference. The woman, the law student, the one with the glasses and the textbooks, and the look of someone who had never once been told that there were rooms she was not supposed to walk into. With that particular expression of calm certainty had disrupted something he had been maintaining for 12 years without significant interference, which was the orderly operation of a specific kind of authority in a specific kind of space. An authority that did not require explanation and did not invite debate, and worked precisely because most people, when they encountered it, made the rational decision to accommodate it rather than test it. He had learned this from Dale Merritt, among other things. He thought about Terence Grant the way you think about old weather, not with guilt, which required the belief that something wrong had happened, but with the mild attentiveness of someone reviewing a procedure that had been followed correctly and then approved by the appropriate parties. The complaint had been filed and resolved. The review had been conducted internally and closed. Merritt had sat across from him afterward in the same kind of unremarkable room and said the same words he had used again on the phone this morning. "You survived one neck case. You'll survive this one." The first time he had heard those words, they had felt like reassurance. Now they felt like a policy. What bothered him about Maya Donovan, what he had been circling without naming since the moment her phone skidded across the courthouse stone, was not the fall itself, which had been unexpected and embarrassing, but which would be addressed through the report, but the look in her eyes after she stood up. Most people looked frightened when they stood up after something like that. Some looked angry. She had looked neither. She had looked like someone who had just gathered the information she came for and was now deciding what to do with it. He called Merritt from the car. The conversation was short, as their conversations always were. Merritt did not use words as though they were cheap, which was the quality that had always made him effective at the particular work he did. "Stick to the report. I'll handle the rest. Get your arm looked at." Calloway thought about that last instruction for a moment, turned it over, and understood it not as concern, but as instruction. He drove to a pharmacy. He bought a soft brace and a box of butterscotch candies, and he spent 4 minutes in the parking lot practicing the angle at which to wear the brace so that it looked like something that had been recommended by a medical professional rather than selected from a spinning rack between the reading glasses and the seasonal vitamins. He looked at himself in the rearview mirror. There was a small abrasion on his right cheekbone where it had grazed the stone, not significant, not dramatic, but visible enough in the right light to be described as an injury sustained in the line of duty during an altercation with a combative subject. He pressed it gently with one finger, winced slightly more than the sensation required, and registered it as usable. What Calloway understood about stories, what 12 years of writing reports had taught him, was that they were not primarily about facts, but about sequence. The sequence you established in the first 24 hours became the framework inside which every subsequent fact was interpreted. A fact that arrived inside your framework confirmed it. A fact that arrived outside your framework was anomalous, suspicious, possibly fabricated. This was not manipulation. This was how stories worked, and the person who wrote the first paragraph held an advantage that was very difficult to overcome, regardless of what happened in the paragraphs that followed. He had written the first paragraph. He had written it well. It said what it needed to say about a combative subject and an officer acting within policy, and an incident that had been appropriately documented by the responding parties. He was not afraid of Maya Donovan. He was not afraid of her because she was 24 years old and alone and a student, and because the people who would review whatever she said next would be reviewing it inside the framework he had already built. And because Merritt had closed more complicated files than this one, and because the system, the entire embedded habitual machinery of who got believed when and by whom, had never once in 12 years given him any reason to think it would stop working on his behalf. He pulled out of the parking lot, touched the brace on his arm lightly to confirm its position, and drove toward the precinct where 3 of his colleagues would meet him at the door, with a nod and a coffee, and the easy solidarity of men who had decided without ever quite saying so aloud that protecting each other was a form of professionalism. The shadow appeared on Odessa's front porch just before 5 o'clock, and nobody inside the house saw it arrive because they were at the dining room table with the shoebox between them and Camille's laptop open, and Terrence Grant's complaint timeline spread across 3 sheets of yellow paper that Odessa had laid out with the methodical patience of a woman who had become over 3 years a very good archivist of her own grief. What made the shadow strange was not that it appeared, but that it stayed without knocking, just a shape visible through the lace curtain beside the door, still and patient, as though it were waiting to be noticed rather than admitted. "I don't get visitors who stand like that," Odessa said, rising slowly with the particular caution of someone who had received enough bad news at her own front door to have developed a healthy suspicion of whoever stood behind it. Camille reached for her phone. Maya stood without entirely meaning to her bruised knee, protesting her hand finding the back of the chair. "Mrs. Grant." The voice through the door was a man's low measured, carrying the specific cadence of someone who had learned to speak carefully in situations where the wrong word had real consequences. "My name is Marcus Webb. I work courthouse security. I need to speak with Maya Donovan." Camille looked at Maya. Maya shook her head slightly. She didn't know the name. Odessa did not reach for the deadbolt. "Say what you came to say through the wood," she called back, and the steadiness in her voice was the steadiness of someone who had stopped being frightened of doors a long time ago. A pause, the brief kind, that meant someone was deciding how much to give before they knew how much would be received. "I saw what Officer Calloway did yesterday," the man said. "Not the clip. The whole thing. Camera 3 caught him putting his arm around her neck. Camera 5 caught him kicking the phone." Maya's breath stopped. Camille raised her phone and pressed record without making a sound. By noon today, the voice continued, both files had been marked corrupted in the system. Odessa looked at Maya. Maya nodded once. Odessa walked to the door and engaged the chain latch before opening it the width the chain allowed, just enough to see the man on the porch. Marcus Webb was broad-shouldered and somewhere in his mid-40s, wearing a plain gray jacket over his security uniform, a Marine Corps pin on the lapel with the kind of eyes that moved to the corners of rooms before settling on the person in the center. Not nervous, just trained. He looked at the bruising on Maya's neck, and something in his jaw tightened. That wasn't restraint, he said, in the quiet way of stating an obvious thing that had been denied too long. How do you know what they marked the files? Maya asked. He reached carefully into his jacket and produced a small flash drive, holding it at his side with 2 fingers. Because I was the one who was told to delete the backup. Odessa stepped back from the door. The chain came off. Marcus came inside and remained standing near the window, checking the street once through the curtain before turning to face them. On the drive camera, 3 camera 5 and a corridor recording taken 40 minutes after the incident. Merritt finding Calloway near the vending machines at the end of the building's east wing, speaking to him with his arms crossed and his voice low and level and entirely audible to the small microphone positioned above the corridor intersection. Camille played the audio. Merritt's voice came through with the clarity of a man who had said similar things in similar corridors for a long time and had never once considered that a corridor might remember. Relax. You survived 1 neck case already. You'll survive this one too. Just stick to the report. Odessa sat down. She sat down the way a person sits when their legs have received information before the rest of them has just a dropping away, a sudden accounting for gravity. She was still holding the framed photograph of Terrence from the side table, and now she pressed it against her chest and closed her eyes, and the room went so quiet that the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen became the loudest sound in the house. They talked about my son like old paperwork, she said very quietly to no one in particular. Marcus looked at the floor. I knew something was wrong after Terrence died. I heard questions about missing footage and told myself suspicion wasn't evidence. He looked at Maya. Then I watched Calloway do the same thing to you. Same arm, same position, same report starting before anyone asked you what happened. He paused. This time I kept the proof. Camille made 4 copies of the drive on her laptop, on Maya's, on an external drive she carried in her bag, and in an encrypted folder sent to a contact whose name she did not say out loud. Working quickly and without ceremony under the yellow light of Odessa's old dining room chandelier, while Marcus stood at the window, and a patrol car rolled slowly past the house and turned the corner without stopping. The formal notice from Wakefield Law School arrived at 7 a.m., as a PDF attachment with a subject line that used the word urgent twice in 11 words, and Maya read it in Camille's car in the parking lot of a gas station where they had stopped for coffee that neither of them was going to taste, because some mornings coffee is just the thing your hands need to hold, while your mind processes something your body already knew was coming. The language of the notice was precise in the way that institutional language is always precise when it is trying to accomplish something it cannot quite say directly. There was alleged misconduct. There was reputational concern for the university community. There was pending police inquiry. There was the scheduling of an emergency conduct hearing to be held in the administration building at 9 o'clock Thursday morning. There was no mention of a chokehold. There was no mention of a bruise. There was nothing in the document that acknowledged that something had been done to Maya Donovan on those steps, only that something had happened, and that the happening was at present a matter of concern. By mid-morning, the local news had run its second segment. A reporter stood outside police headquarters with the careful gravity of someone delivering important information while Merritt appeared in his uniform behind a cluster of microphones, his expression composed and grave. The face of a man very accustomed to the particular performance of institutional reassurance. Officer Calloway acted with restraint under difficult circumstances. We are reviewing all available footage and will ensure a thorough and transparent process. The word transparent landed in Maya's stomach like something cold. The TikTok video that had started circulating overnight, the one that began with Calloway hitting the courthouse steps set to a sound that made it look like a comedy, had passed 400,000 views by the time Camille checked, and the comments were a specific kind of awful that Maya had learned early not to read, but could not always stop herself from reading the ones that said she deserved it, and the ones that said, "This is what happens when," and the ones that said, "typical," without specifying typical of what. because they didn't need to specify because the word was carrying something that everyone in the exchange already understood. A reporter outside the precinct caught a brief clip of Calloway walking to his vehicle, his expression unreadable behind sunglasses, the sling on his arm clearly visible, and on his face the particular expression of a man who knows the camera is on him and has decided the camera is an opportunity rather than a threat. Merritt answered every question with variations of the same sentence. At Odessa's house, where they had gathered again by midday without formally deciding to, Odessa sat in front of the small television and watched Merritt's face on the screen and pointed at it with one finger, the way you point at something you have been trying to get people to look at for 3 years. "That's him," she said. "That's the man who told me my son caused his own death." The room went very still. Then Camille's phone buzzed with an image attached to an unknown number, a photograph of Maya leaving a gas station, the scarf wrapped around her neck, her face caught mid-turn as though she had heard something behind her. Under the image, 3 words, "Stop digging now." And then, 20 minutes later, a second message, this one to Maya's phone from a different unknown number containing a photograph that made the breath go out of the room entirely. It was a photograph of Vivian Donovan's house, Maya's mother's house, taken from across the street in the particular flat light of early morning. The small white porch with its 2 clay pots of red geraniums. The front window, where a lamp Maya's mother kept burning through the night, made a warm square of light against the pale facade. 3 words underneath in the same typeface as the first message, mothers should stop talking. Maya called her mother before the fear could argue her out of it, and Vivian Donovan answered on the first ring, which meant she had been awake and waiting because Vivian had always possessed the specific maternal talent of knowing when her daughter's silence was a sign that something was being held rather than resolved. "Tell me you're safe," Vivian said without greeting. "I'm safe." Maya paused. "I need to show you something." She sent the photograph her mother's house, the geraniums, the morning light, the 3 words underneath, and listened to the silence on the other end of the line with the particular attention you give silence when you need to understand what kind it is. Vivian's silence lasted exactly long enough to look at the image carefully, which was her way. She did not react to things before she had examined them, because she had learned over 52 years of being a black woman in the state of Georgia that reacting without examining was a luxury that tended to cost you the very clarity you needed to respond effectively. "They took this from the street," Vivian said finally. "Not a question." "Yes, Mama." Another pause, shorter this time. And then, with the same steadiness her daughter had inherited and spent years learning to use, "I have been black in Georgia for 52 years. Danger and I have already met." Maya pressed her fingers against the fading edge of the bruise on her neck. "I don't want you in this." "I'm already in it," Vivian said, "because you're in it, and you are the thing I love most in the world. And that means there is no version of this where I watch from the outside and call it wisdom." Her voice hardened slightly around the edges, the way it hardened when she was preparing to say something she had been thinking through for a while. If they're warning you away from Terrence Grant's case, it means they're afraid of what's in it. Fear this specific is usually sitting right on top of the truth. By 3 o'clock, they were all at Odessa's house, Maya and Camille and Marcus, and now Vivian, who arrived with a foil-wrapped pan of food because, as she explained without embarrassment, people needed to eat when the world was coming apart, and a kitchen that produced something warm was still a form of dignity that no amount of threat could take away. Vivian and Odessa sat across from each other at the dining room table for a while, before either of them spoke, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable, but weighted the particular weight of 2 mothers from the same city and the same generation, who understood each other's fear with the precision of fluency, because it was the same fear wearing 2 different faces, one still fighting to protect, one still carrying what protection had not been enough to prevent. Vivian reached across the table and put her hand over Odessa's. She did not say anything. She just left her hand there for a long moment, and Odessa looked down at it, and then looked up at the wall where Terrence's photographs lived, and she nodded a small deliberate nod that meant something. Maya couldn't fully translate, but didn't need to. Marcus sat near the window in his usual position, watching the street with the patience of a man who had spent years in uniform, learning that threats rarely announced themselves but almost always had a preparatory posture you could learn to read if you paid close enough attention. He had checked outside twice since they arrived. The patrol car had not come back. Camille opened her laptop and began laying out the timeline again. Complaint dates. Merritt's signatures, the gap between when Terrence's witnesses gave statements and when those statements changed, and the table became what it had been becoming since the morning after the courthouse steps, a room where people who had been told separately that nothing could be done had begun quietly and without ceremony to disagree. That evening, Maya went where her body knew how to breathe. Souza Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu sat in a narrow strip mall between a barber shop and a tax office that advertised fast refunds in red paint on its front window on a street in southwest Atlanta that smelled in the evenings of cooking oil and cut grass and the faint diesel exhaust of the late bus, and Maya had been coming to this particular building 3 evenings a week since she was 15 years old, and had first walked in after school with a bruise on her wrist from something that had happened in a hallway that she did not have the language yet to explain. And Coach Renata had not asked for the language, had only said, "Sit down, let me show you something." The gym smelled of floor mats and disinfectant and old coffee from the machine near the front desk that nobody had cleaned in the specific way it needed since 2019. Photographs of tournaments and belt promotions lined the walls. Children standing with their parents in GIs that were slightly too large, competitors frozen in the middle of movements that looked impossible from the outside and felt from the inside like geometry that had briefly taken on a life of its own. Coach Renata Souza was 60 years old and had silver hair cut close to her head and hands thickened from 4 decades of gripping things precisely, and she was wiping down the main mat with a mop when Maya came through the door, and she looked up and stopped moving. One look at the scarf. One look at Maya's face. "Who?" she said. "A cop," Maya said. Renata set the mop against the wall and walked to Maya and waited not touching until Maya unwrapped the scarf slowly. Renata examined the bruise with careful eyes and the particular gentleness of someone who understood injury as a language and did not need it translated into emotional terms to respond to it correctly. She pressed nothing, moved nothing, just looked. "This was not restraint," she said. "This was a man punishing you for not being afraid of him." Maya's composure fractured then, not into tears exactly, but into something adjacent to them, a release of pressure that had been holding since the courthouse steps, and had not found a clean way out until this moment in this room with this person, who did not need the full story to understand the essential fact. "I was afraid," Maya said, because it felt important to say. "Of course you were," Renata said. "Courage without fear is just a person who hasn't understood the situation yet." She walked to a bench and came back with a roll of athletic tape and sat across from Maya and began wrapping the scrapes on Maya's knuckles with the slow, deliberate care of someone repairing something that mattered. "Jiu-Jitsu doesn't teach you how to hurt people," she said, working the tape around Maya's fingers. "It teaches you how to survive people who have decided they own your life." Maya looked down at her hands, at the scarf on the bench between them, at the mat she had spent 9 years on, learning that her own body was not something that happened to her, but something she could understand and use and trust. Odessa's voicemail was still on Maya's phone from earlier in the day, and she played it on speaker without quite deciding to. And Renata's voice fell quiet, and the older men near the front desk who had been talking in low voices about knee replacements and grandchildren and a barbecue someone was planning went silent without being asked. Odessa's voice came through the small speaker and filled the gym the way certain voices fill spaces without effort. "Maya, I know you're tired. I know they're trying to make fear look like wisdom. But my son didn't survive long enough to speak. You did. Don't let them convince you that breathing is the same as being free." Renata looked at Maya. "What will you do?" Maya stood slowly, her knee aching, her throat still raw, her fear still present, but no longer the loudest thing in the room. "I'll go to the hearing," she said, and I'll bring the dead with me. The morning before the hearing arrived with the specific bleakness of mornings that require you to do difficult things before you have had time to construct your reasons for doing them, and Camille called at 7:14 with the information Maya had already half expected but had been hoping to avoid. The gas station cashier, the first witness from Terrence Grant's case, the one who had given the most specific statement, who had described the handcuffs, who had described Calloway's arm position with the precision of someone who had been standing close and looking directly, had vacated her apartment overnight. A neighbor who spoke briefly to Camille through a partially opened door said 2 men had come asking questions the day before. She would not describe the men or say who had sent them. She kept looking toward the parking lot as she spoke. Marcus had received 3 missed calls from his precinct supervisor before 8 o'clock, and a text message that read in the careful language of institutional threat. We need to discuss unauthorized file access at your earliest convenience. Maya pressed her fingers against the fading edge of her bruise. It was yellowing at the margins now, the way bruises did when they were preparing to disappear. And the disappearing frightened her more than the bruise itself had, because she had been right there with Odessa. When she said it, pain fades faster than people think. That's why they wait. They found the rideshare driver, Paula Meadows' 56-years-old grandmother from Decatur, a woman who had driven night shifts for 2 years to pay down the debt from her husband's stroke, and who still carried the careful, watchful patience of someone who had learned that the world could change the terms of a situation without warning in the parking lot behind an old diner off Memorial Drive in the thin Georgia afternoon light, with her keys already in her hand. Paula Meadows looked at Maya's bruised neck without making it obvious she was looking, and when Maya said she wasn't asking her to testify, just to confirm what she had seen, Paula's face moved through several expressions with the speed of a woman calculating costs that Maya could not fully see. I saw Terrence on the ground, Paula said finally. I saw the officer's arm around his neck. Terrence was handcuffed. I said that the first time. She paused. Then 2 officers came to my church asking whether my grandson still lived with me. She looked toward the road. I've got a daughter holding onto a nursing license by 2 threads and a boy applying to college next fall. I'm sorry. I truly am. She drove away before Maya could speak. Maya stood in the parking lot as Camille's car idled beside her and watched Paula Meadows' taillights disappear around the far end of the lot, and the weight of the afternoon settled over her in the way that complicated grief settles not with noise, but with the quiet understanding that the people who couldn't speak were not failures. They were simply people who had children and mortgages and prescriptions and jobs, and the specific knowledge of what happened to people who publicly embarrassed men protected by other men. The rain began not heavily, but with the persistent flat insistence of a rain that intends to stay a while. Maya got in the back seat. Camille and Marcus were both quiet in the way that meant they were waiting. We stopped chasing scared witnesses, Maya said not loudly, more to herself than to them, working it out as she said it. We stopped trying to find the people they've already frightened. We make the people protecting Calloway become the witnesses themselves. Camille looked at her in the rearview mirror. How Maya touched the bruise on her neck with 2 fingers, the fading crescent beneath her jaw, and looked out at the rain-slicked Atlanta streets, moving past the window churches and laundromats and late buses, and people getting on with their lives in the particular brave, exhausted way that people who have never had the option of not getting on with things always manage to get on with things. We let them think I'm alone, she said. Then we record what they do when they come to finish the lie. Thursday morning came in cold and clear, the kind of Atlanta autumn morning where the light has a quality of precision to it. Everything slightly sharper than usual, the shadows thin and deliberate, the air carrying the smell of rain from 2 days before that had not quite finished evaporating from the pavement. Maya dressed carefully and slowly, the way you dress when you understand that how you enter a room is part of the argument you are making before a word has been spoken. Black blazer pressed flat. White blouse buttoned to the second from the top. Flat shoes. Her hair back and clean. The wire-rimmed glasses she had almost replaced 3 times but kept because they were the pair she had been wearing when she passed her first clinic advocacy review and some things you keep not for sentiment, but for continuity. The scarf she tied loosely not to conceal the bruise which had deepened to a yellow-green at the edges and remained vivid at the center, but to frame it in a way that made it look like what it was, a mark someone had left on her body carried openly into the room where it would be discussed, because she had decided she was not going to be the one making it smaller. Camille arrived first, checked the recorder in Maya's bag, and attached a small microphone to the inside seam of her lapel with the efficient movements of someone who had done this before in situations where what happened in a room needed to be preserved outside the room's control. Marcus came next, freshly shaved and carrying a quality of stillness that Maya had come to recognize as his version of preparation, a settling inward, a reduction of unnecessary motion. Odessa arrived at 10 minutes to 8 in a navy blue dress and her church shoes, carrying Terrence's framed photograph in both hands against her chest with the slight forward lean of someone protecting something fragile. Vivian came behind her with a thermos of coffee and the look on her face that Maya had seen before on only a handful of very specific mornings, the look of a woman who had decided that fear was going to have to wait its turn. They drove in the quiet that belongs to people who have said everything they needed to say, and are now simply moving toward the place where the saying will matter. The Wakefield Law School Administration Building was a glass and brick structure that had been renovated twice since Maya had enrolled, and still managed to look from the inside like a space designed primarily to remind everyone in it of the difference between the people seated at the long table and the people seated across from it. The lobby was already warm when they arrived, students arriving for early morning classes, casting sideways looks at the group that came through the main entrance and moved with the particular purposefulness that made people unconsciously step aside. Maya stopped at the glass doors of the building's interior corridor and looked through them at the conference room at the end. She could see the long, polished table, the fluorescent light, the chairs already arranged with the institutional precision of a room designed to make one side of the table feel like furniture and the other side feel like a problem to be managed. She stood there for a moment that was longer than it needed to be and shorter than she wanted. Behind her, Odessa touched her elbow once the lightest touch barely weighed at all, and Maya thought of Terrence Grant in his Falcons jersey of his daughter on his shoulders, laughing at something outside the frame of the photograph of his wrists and the red thread spelling his name above the pocket of his work shirt. She pushed the door open. The room was colder than it needed to be, and whether that was the building's climate control or the particular temperature of rooms where institutional power prepares to protect itself, Maya could not have said, but she felt it the moment she stepped inside a deliberate cold, the kind that made you aware of your own body. Dean Patricia Holt sat at the center of the long table with the composed, unreadable expression of a woman who had occupied positions of authority long enough to have developed a face that did not commit to anything before it needed to silver-haired, impeccably dressed a person who understood that her primary responsibility in this room was to manage the institution's exposure rather than to discover the truth. To her right sat Professor Leonard Marsh from the Ethics Committee, a man Maya had liked for 2 years, and who was now examining the surface of the table in the manner of someone who had concluded that eye contact would require a position he had not finished deciding whether to take. To Holt's left sat Rebecca Vance, the university counsel whose professional smile was the kind that occupied the face without warming it, the tool of someone whose job was to care about outcomes rather than people. Maya walked in and remained standing. "Am I required to be here without legal representation?" she said before anyone could begin. Vance's pen paused. Holt's expression tightened along the edges in the almost imperceptible way of a face accustomed to having the opening of a conversation managed for it. "This is an internal conduct review," Holt said carefully. "Not a criminal proceeding. Then I'd like it noted for the record. Maya said that I'm participating voluntarily and under formal objection to the absence of adequate advance notice." She sat down slowly. From somewhere behind her, she heard Camille make a small sound that might have been approval if she'd had less composure. Odessa sat along the wall. Marcus stood near the corner. Vivienne took the chair beside Odessa with the stillness of a woman who had decided that stillness was a form of presence. Holt glanced at them, and Maya answered before the question could be asked. "They are here as witnesses to the parts of the truth your file probably doesn't include." Holt folded her hands. The presentation that followed was careful and quiet and devastating in the specific way that institutional language is devastating not by saying anything brutal, but by the precise assembly of words that accomplished brutality through the architecture of respectability. Appears to show, raises concerns, questions of judgment, emotional control, suitability for continued placement. Each phrase a small brick in a wall being built around Maya's credibility, and Maya sat on her side of the table and translated each one in real time, the way you translate a language you have been studying long enough to hear not just the words, but the intentions behind them. Judgment meant, why did you not accept being choked without response? Emotional control meant, why did you not remain still while someone took your air? Suitability meant, why are you still here asking us to account for something we would very much prefer to consider closed? Then the door opened. Brett Calloway walked in wearing his uniform with the careful dignity of a man who had prepared his entrance. The new soft brace on his right arm adjusted to a precise angle. A small bruise on his right cheekbone that had the too neat quality of something applied with care. His expression arranged into the specific blend of injury and forbearance that the situation called for. Behind him came Dale Merritt, broad, silver-badged, the particular weight of a man who had spent decades making rooms feel smaller than they were. Merritt's badge caught the fluorescent light when he moved and held it for a second too long. Odessa's hands tightened around Terrence's frame. Marcus looked at Merritt with the steady, unblinking attention of someone who had been waiting for this specific moment in a room with other people present. Calloway sat across from Maya and arranged his face into an expression of wounded patience, the face of a man performing injuries for an audience, and his eyes moved to her for just a moment before moving away. And in that moment, Maya saw the same thing she had seen on the courthouse steps, a man who believed he was standing on ground that would not move beneath him. Holt invited him to speak. He spoke in the measured, practiced cadence of someone who had rehearsed his version often enough that it had begun to feel like memory, an officer acting within policy, a student who became agitated and combative, an attack he had not anticipated, injuries sustained in the line of duty. And Maya sat with her hands folded on the table, and did not let her face do anything the room could use against her, and waited for the moment she had been building toward since she had stood in her bathroom 3 nights ago and understood what the shape of a bruise could mean. Calloway finished speaking, and Holt turned to Maya with the expression of a woman extending a procedural courtesy rather than a genuine invitation. And Maya began her response in the same, even measured voice she used in moot court. The voice her clinic supervisor had once told her was her greatest asset, because it carried authority without signaling the authority was defensive. Yes, she said. She had used a BJJ technique. She had used it after Officer Calloway had applied a sustained chokehold to her throat after he had kicked her phone away from where it had landed after he had begun to list charges that did not correspond to anything she had done, and after his hand had reached for the handcuffs on his belt while she was still deprived of sufficient air to speak clearly in her own defense. She had used it with the minimum force required to interrupt the restraint, and she had released him immediately and stepped back with both hands visible, and she had identified herself clearly, and she had refused to give a statement without legal representation. That sounds like a threat, Vance said about a sentence Maya had not yet finished. No, Maya said. It is a fact. Calloway made a small sound, not quite a laugh, contained enough to pass as involuntary, and it was precisely the sound Maya had expected, which was why she had waited for it before she continued. I'd like to ask, Maya said, addressing Holt directly, whether the conduct review file includes any reference to a man named Terrence Grant. The name hit the room the way a name hits a room when the people in it either know it and have been hoping it wouldn't be said, or know it and have been waiting for it to be said, because there is no neutral way to land a name like that in a room like this one, only the 2 kinds of silence that follow from those 2 different types of recognition. Holt frowned. Who is Terrence Grant? and before Maya could answer, Odessa Grant rose from her chair along the wall. She rose slowly with the deliberate economy of a woman who knew that everything she did in this room would be observed and assessed and potentially used, and she stood with Terrence's photograph pressed against her chest and looked at Holt with the flat, steady gaze of a woman who had been told no by enough official rooms to have stopped being impressed by their furniture. "My son Odessa said." The room was quiet. "He died in police custody 3 years ago." Odessa continued. Brett Calloway was the responding officer. The bruising on his neck looked exactly like what is on that young woman's throat today. Merritt stepped forward from his position behind Calloway. "This is inappropriate and inflammatory," he said in the tone of a man who knew that the words inappropriate and inflammatory had historically been effective at shutting down the specific type of conversation that was beginning to happen. "It's documented," Camille said from her corner without looking up from her laptop. Miss Okafor Vance said sharply, "You are not recognized in this proceeding." Camille looked up. "That's never stopped the truth before." Holt raised her hand, and the room held its breath for a moment in the way that rooms do when they are deciding whether to obey the raised hand or follow the momentum that has accumulated beyond the raised hand's reach. And then, before anyone spoke again, Maya's phone buzzed. Then Camille's. Then Professor Marsh's phone lit up on the table in front of him, and a second later the phone of a staff member visible through the glass panel beside the door, and a third phone somewhere in the hallway produced a sound that carried through the wall clearly enough for everyone in the room to hear it. Camille had scheduled the first release. Through the glass panel, Maya could already see students slowing in the hallway taking out their phones, watching something looking up at the conference room glass, and then back down the way people look when they are connecting information from 2 different sources and the connection is disturbing them. Calloway looked at Merritt. Merritt looked at the wall. Holt's voice came out careful and slightly compressed, the voice of someone trying to maintain the architecture of authority while the foundation beneath it was registering the first tremors. "Miss Donovan," she said, "did you authorize the release of materials related to this proceeding?" Maya looked at Holt and at Calloway and at the photograph Odessa was still holding pressed against her chest and at the hallway beyond the glass where Terrence Grant's story was now moving at the speed of a signal through a network of people who had been waiting for something real to hold. "I authorized the truth," she said. The noise from the hallway had passed from individual sounds into something continuous and building the way a crowd passes from scattered voices into a single pressure and through the glass panel beside the conference room door. Maya could see students gathering in a half circle around the screens of their phones. Some of them already turned to face the glass with the particular expression of people who have seen something that has changed the way they are looking at the room beyond it. "That video is manipulated," Calloway said before Camille had opened a single file. He said it with the reflexive confidence of someone who had decided the best defense of a lie was to preemptively contaminate the category of evidence. Camille opened the laptop without hurrying. "Good," she said. "Then let's start before the video." But Maya was already standing. She reached up and unwrapped the scarf. Not with drama, not with the performative slowness of a reveal designed for maximum effect, but with the quiet matter-of-factness of someone completing a necessary procedure, the way a doctor removes a bandage because the wound beneath it has reached the point where it needs to be in the room with everyone else. The scarf came away and she set it on the table. Under the fluorescent light of the Wakefield Law School conference room, on the neck of a 24-year-old black woman who had come to the courthouse 3 days ago with a canvas bag full of law books and a thermos with a hairline crack. The bruising was vivid and precise, the crescent beneath the jaw, the pressure line along the left side of the throat, the concentration of force at the point where a forearm applied at the correct angle, with the correct amount of weight behind it, would compress the airway most efficiently. Nobody spoke. Odessa rose from her chair. She rose with both hands already moving toward the front of the frame she had been carrying all morning, and she set Terrence's photograph on the table. And then she reached into the bag she had brought the worn canvas tote from Terrence's last church picnic, and she removed the tissue-wrapped photograph that Maya had looked at 2 days ago at the dining room table, and she unwrapped it and placed it beside Terrence's framed portrait on the polished wood of the conference table. The autopsy photograph. The photograph of Terrence Grant's neck. Now they were side by side, the photograph of what had been done to Terrence Grant in October 3 years ago, and Maya Donovan standing in the same room with what had been done to her neck in October 3 days ago, and the shape was the same, and the position was the same, and the specific geometry of force that had produced both was so clearly identical that the room did not need a forensic expert to confirm what anyone with eyes could read. Professor Marsh took his glasses off. He held them in his hand and looked at the two photographs and at Maya's neck, and at the photographs again, and his face moved through something that had nothing to do with academic procedure, something older and more personal than the role he had been occupying for the last 40 minutes. "My God," he said very quietly to no one in particular. Calloway was the one who broke the silence, and in breaking it he produced the thing that completed the trap. He had not understood he was walking into. "That's old evidence from a closed case," he said. Confident, dismissive. The tone of a man on familiar ground. And the room registered, every person in it registered that Brett Calloway had identified Terrence Grant's autopsy photograph without being told whose photograph it was. Merritt understood a half-second after Calloway what had just happened, and Maya watched the comprehension move through his face like weather, a brief tightening, a rapid reclassification of the situation, but it was a half-second too late, and the room had already recorded it. Camille opened camera 3. The image that filled the laptop screen was not the clip that had circulated online, not the clipped, carefully bounded clip that began with Calloway already on the courthouse steps. This was the full footage time-stamped at 8:47 a.m., and it began with Maya standing beside Odessa Grant, her canvas bag over one shoulder, her hand raised in a gesture of calm explanation, and it showed with the flat, unambiguous clarity of a fixed lens exactly the sequence in which the morning had unfolded. Calloway crossing the steps, his hand on Maya's wrist, his arm coming up and around her throat. Maya's mouth opening around words the camera could not hear, but that her lips formed with unmistakable clarity. "I can't breathe." The kick that sent the phone spinning, the reach for the handcuffs, and then the pivot, the technique, the fall, and Maya standing back with both hands visible while Calloway rose from the stone. Holt stared at the screen. Camille opened the hallway recording without being asked. Merritt's voice came through the laptop speaker in the quality of audio captured by a fixed corridor microphone, slightly compressed but perfectly clear. Every word, distinct with the particular acoustic flatness of a person who was not performing for a room, but simply speaking to another person in a hallway they believed was empty of consequence. "Relax. You survived one neck case already. You'll survive this one too. Just stick to the report." Odessa's hand flew to her mouth. The room went so quiet that the hum of the building's HVAC system became audible, a low, steady sound that had been there all along, and that nobody had been able to hear until this moment, because the noise of power operating normally had been filling the space it occupied. Merritt said, "Out of context." Camille looked at him with an expression of professional patience. "Please explain the context in which one neck case means anything other than Terrence Grant." Calloway turned to look at Merritt, a turn of the head that was quick and involuntary and instinctive, the glance of a man looking for instruction in a situation where the instruction was supposed to have prevented this from happening, and Merritt did not look back at him, because Merritt was looking at the laptop screen and recalculating, and the absence of that confirming look was something every person in the room saw and understood and would remember. In the hallway through the glass a sound had begun. Not a chant, yet barely organized somewhere between confusion and revelation, and it was the sound of Terrence Grant's name moving through a building where it had never been spoken before. Holt placed her phone face down on the table very carefully, with the precise movement of someone managing a physiological response in public and succeeding only partially. Outside the conference room the sound grew. The door opened with a purposeful precision that was different from every other time the door had opened that morning. Not the entrance of someone navigating an unfamiliar situation, but the entrance of someone who had been briefed, who had read whatever there was to read on the way over, and who was now walking into a room they had already mapped. Lieutenant Diane Osei was in her early 40s with close-cropped natural hair and a navy suit worn with the ease of someone to whom professional clothing was armor in the literal sense, protective rather than decorative. And she moved with the steady, economical pace of a woman who had spent enough years in institutions that moved slowly to have learned that entering a room without apology was itself a form of communication. She stood at the threshold for a single extended moment and surveyed the room, the two photographs on the table. The laptop screen still showing the hallway recording, Maya standing with her scarf folded beside her, and the bruise fully visible. Merritt against the wall with the recalculating expression of a man who had just understood that the room had changed composition. Calloway in the chair across from the long table with a quality of stillness that had passed from strategy into shock. Osei's eyes moved to the two photographs on the table and stayed there for several seconds. The photograph of Terence Grant and the bruise on Maya's neck, and in those seconds she did not speak, and the room did not offer anything to fill the silence, because the silence was doing something that words would only interrupt. "I'm Lieutenant Diane Osei," she said finally to the room. "Internal Affairs, Atlanta PD." She looked at Calloway. "Officer Calloway, remove your duty weapon from your holster and place it on the table." Calloway went pale beneath his uniform in the visible physical way that color leaves a person's face when the ground beneath them disappears. Merritt moved forward. "That is entirely unnecessary, and I would strongly advise." "Sergeant Merritt." Osei did not raise her voice. She did not adjust her stance. She simply stopped his sentence by placing the weight of her attention on him in the way that people who have genuine authority rather than performed authority use attention as a tool. "If you speak again before I ask you a direct question, I will remove you from this room and add obstruction to your file, which I understand is already developing some complexity." "Do you understand?" Merritt said nothing. Marcus stepped away from the wall, the movement deliberate, the step of a man who had been waiting for the right moment and had recognized it and addressed Osei directly. He confirmed everything he had said at Odessa's door 2 days ago in the clear sequential language of someone giving a sworn statement. The instruction to delete the backup files, his refusal, the preservation of the copies. He named the date and time of each event with the precision of a man who had been keeping track because he had known at some level that the day would come when the track would matter. Osei listened without interrupting. When Marcus finished, she looked at the table for a moment, then back at Calloway. "Please place your weapon on the table," she said again with the patience of someone for whom repetition is not a concession, but a formality. Calloway unholstered his weapon with the slow, specific movements of a man performing an action his body did not want to perform and placed it on the polished wood of the conference table. And the sound it made was a small, dense, metallic sound, brief and conclusive, and something in the room shifted when it landed, the way air shifts, when a pressure that has been building finally finds its release. "Officer Brett Calloway," Osei said in the measured, unhurried voice of someone reading from a document. "They have already reviewed. You are relieved of duty, effective immediately, pending investigation into allegations of assault, falsification of official reports, evidence tampering, and potential connection to the death in custody of Terence Grant." She turned. "Sergeant Dale Merritt the same," Merritt said. On what basis, in the tone of a man whose certainty was structural, built into the walls rather than chosen, and was therefore failing slowly rather than all at once? Osei looked at the laptop screen at Merritt's own voice captured in the corridor of the courthouse 40 minutes after the incident, and then she looked at Merritt with an expression that was neither triumphant nor particularly warm. "On the basis," she said, "that you were careless enough to say the quiet part near a camera." Through the glass panel beside the door, the hallway was full. Student staff, a custodian who had stopped his cart, 2 older professors who had come out of their offices to see what the sound meant. And threading through all of it, passed from phone to phone, from mouth to mouth, the name that had been buried in a closed file for 3 years and was now moving through the building like something that had been waiting a long time for the right kind of air. Terence Grant. Terence Grant. Terrence Grant. Odessa pressed her son's photograph to her chest and closed her eyes, and the sound of his name being said aloud by people who had never known him moved through her the way long-delayed things move through a person who has stopped hoping for them and then received them anyway. The conference room emptied in the specific way that rooms empty when the thing they were assembled to manage has resolved itself in a direction no one on the managing side had planned for. Not with disorder, but with a kind of abrupt deflation. People finding reasons to be elsewhere, chairs pushed back at angles that suggested hurry without acknowledging it. Calloway was escorted out through the side door of the building by 2 officers who had arrived with Osei, and through the glass panel, Maya watched him move down the corridor with the diminished, slightly uncertain gait of a man who had spent 12 years being escorted toward things and was now discovering what it felt like to be escorted away from them. A cluster of students in the hallway parted to let them through and then closed again and watched, and not one face that Maya could see through the glass wore the expression of surprise. Merritt followed minutes later, and what Maya noticed about Merritt's exit was not the loss of the badge or the expression on his face, but the way the room changed when he left it, as though something that had been generating a specific kind of pressure had been removed, and the air was figuring out how to distribute itself into the space it had previously been prevented from occupying. The live stream Camille had been running from the corner of the room had numbers climbing faster than the screen could refresh, and civil rights attorneys and independent journalists and alumni networks and church circles were in the process of doing what communities do. When they receive information they have been waiting to receive, amplifying it, contextualizing it, connecting it to everything they had already known and been unable to prove. Attorney Josephine Reyes had arrived not as a surprise, but as the consequence of a text message Camille had sent 2 nights ago at 11:15 p.m., following a principle Camille had described simply as, "You prep the exit before you need it," and Reyes now stood near the door, confirming the formal elements of Maya's representation with the brisk, precise movements of a person who was simultaneously in 3 conversations and losing track of none of them. Marsh sat alone at the long table with his glasses in his hand, not looking at any one thing. After a long moment, he said very quietly, "Miss Donovan, I am ashamed," and the sentence was simple and insufficient and true. Maya looked at him. "Then be useful," she said. The words had come from Odessa 2 days ago at the dining room table, and they had arrived in Maya's mouth now with the weight of being borrowed from someone who had earned the right to give them. Marcus stood beside Odessa near the table where the 2 photographs still lay, and he looked at the photograph of Terrence Grant with the specific expression of a man who had been carrying something for 3 years, while telling himself it was not heavy, discovering in this moment what it felt like to set it down. "I should have spoken sooner," he said to Odessa, rather than to the room. Rather than, "You're speaking now," she said. The absence of bitterness in her voice was not forgiveness or its withholding. It was something more specific than either the voice of a woman who had decided that what the moment required was not an accounting, but a witness, and that Marcus Webb was present and willing, and that was enough to work with. Osei approached Maya before leaving and told her in the practical and unhurried manner she seemed to apply to everything that the formal statement would be taken tomorrow, that it would be handled with care, and that Terrence Grant's file had already been flagged for full reinvestigation, and that she was sorry for what had happened on the steps and for the 3 years that had preceded it. "Not here," Osei said, looking at the conference room with its long table and its institutional lighting. "Not like this." Maya looked out through the glass at the hallway full of people who had watched the whole thing unfold, and were now standing with the slightly stunned quality of people who had expected the walls to hold and had just seen them open. Maya had not planned to return to the courthouse steps before giving her formal statement, and there was no practical reason to do it. And when her feet began carrying her in that direction after she left the administration building, she did not examine the impulse too carefully, because some things do not benefit from examination, and this was one of them. Camille drove without being asked. Vivian sat in the front seat and looked out the window at Atlanta moving past in the clear October morning storefronts and churches and delivery trucks and people on phones at bus stops with the expression of a woman taking a particular inventory of the world and finding it still recognizable, which was itself a form of relief. Odessa had said she wanted to come, and nobody said no to her because there was no version of that conversation anyone was willing to have. The courthouse steps were clean and empty of what had happened 3 days ago. The coffee, the scattered pages, the telephone, the particular violence of that specific morning, all of it replaced by the ordinary Tuesday activity of a courthouse on a clear day, people arriving and departing with their manila envelopes and their appointments, and their private catastrophes that the building processed at the same disinterested rate. It processed everything. At the cafe tables on the sidewalk, 2 old veterans had their chess pieces arranged but untouched. One of them, a man in a flat cap whose name Maya had learned over the 3 years she had been coming to this courthouse for clinic work, stood up when he saw her walking toward the steps. "Morning, counselor," he said. "Morning, Mr. Jenkins," she said, and her voice was rough but steady. He looked at the bruise on her neck uncovered, now the scarf folded in her bag, and then looked at the cameras gathering across the street with the patient recognition of someone who had lived long enough to have seen several different versions of this morning. "Take those pictures while you can," he said. "Buildings remember less than people do. That's why people got to speak, too." Maya climbed the steps, slowly. Odessa beside her, both women facing the stone and the glass doors, and the building that housed whatever justice currently meant in this city, and this year, and this particular iteration of a very old argument. Odessa stood very still for a moment. They brought him through a back entrance. She said not to Maya, but to the building itself, or to the air, or to the specific grief that had been attending her for 3 years, like a companion she had never chosen. After. So I wouldn't see. I used to wonder if this building knew what happened inside it. Maya looked at the doors. Today, it knows, she said. Odessa turned to her. She reached out with 2 fingers and touched the scarf that was no longer around Maya's neck, touched the space where it had been, and then touched Maya's shoulder with the same 2 fingers, a gesture so light it barely registered as pressure. The grief in her face did not resolve into something easier. It just shared the frame with something else, something quieter and harder, and built from the specific material of a mother who had not stopped. "He stole my boy's breath," Odessa said. "But yours brought him back." Maya could not speak for a full 10 seconds. Reporters were calling questions from behind the barricade, but Camille lifted one hand, and they waited. Because Camille had spent enough years at the edge of other people's important moments to know the difference between a moment being over and a moment only appearing to be over. Attorney Reyes arrived at the bottom of the steps, brisk and composed, and said to Maya quietly that she didn't owe the cameras anything, and owed her formal statement to the record, and everything else was her choice. Maya looked at the courthouse doors. Then she turned to face the cameras and spoke not loudly, not with the performed emotion of a person giving a speech, but with the plain and precise voice of someone who has decided that the truth does not require amplification to be heard by the people who are ready to hear it. "My name is Maya Donovan," she said, and the cameras clicked and the reporters went still, and the people who had gathered, students from the law school church, elders from New Hope Baptist, who had come in their weekday clothes, 2 women from the neighborhood near the courthouse who had heard about the hearing and come without explanation, the 2 veterans from the cafe table with the untouched chess pieces, and Marcus Webb standing at the back of the group with his marine pin catching the light. All of them went quiet in the particular way that people go quiet when they understand that what is being said is for the record. 3 days ago, Officer Brett Calloway put his arm around my throat on these steps, she said. For 2 days, the world saw only the part of that morning where I got free. They did not see what made getting free necessary. She paused, not for effect, but because the next part required something from her that was not the same thing as the part before it. "This is not only my story," she said. 3 years ago, a man named Terrence Grant did not get free. His mother was told he had resisted. His file was closed. His name was buried under the official language of a system that had decided his death was more manageable than the truth of his death. Behind her, Odessa lifted Terrence's photograph. "Yesterday, that language began to break," Maya said. "Not because everything is fixed. Because the people who benefit from things being broken made the mistake of doing the same thing twice to someone who was still alive to speak about it." A reporter called out Miss Donovan, "How does it feel to be vindicated?" Maya looked at Odessa before she answered. She looked at the photograph of Terrence in his Falcons jersey, and the photograph of Terrence holding his daughter on his shoulders, and the frame with the black ribbon that Odessa still carried with both hands against her chest, as though she were carrying him. "I'm not vindicated while Terrence Grant is still reduced to a closed file," Maya said. "This is not the end. This is the first honest sentence." The crowd was very still. Odessa stepped forward, and her voice, when it came, carried the particular quality of a voice that has been saving itself for a long time for exactly this kind of moment. Not loud, not performed, but with the acoustic weight of something true said in a place where the truth had not been welcome. "My son died begging for air," she said. "Today somebody finally listened. Nobody cheered. Nobody applauded. The crowd simply absorbed it the way a room absorbs something it has been cold and airless without for too long." Maya felt the bruise beneath her collarbone fading at the edges, still present at the center, and understood that Calloway had left it there, believing it would become a mark of fear. She had carried it for 3 days, and it had become something else, a door through which Terrence Grant had finally been able to walk back into the light, 3 years late on a Tuesday in October, on the steps of a building that had watched his mother try to open for 36 months without anyone inside holding it open. She turned toward the courthouse doors. One slow breath, not easy, not painless, still carrying the residue of his forearm and the 3 nights she had not fully slept, and the weight of everything that was still unresolved and would remain so for longer than she wanted but free. She went inside to give her statement. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to like this video and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from tonight. Your support means everything and helps our channel reach people who need to hear stories like this one. Subscribe to our channel and turn on the bell so you don't miss what comes next. That evening, Odessa Grant moved through her living room in the particular quiet of a house that has held grief for so long that even small rearrangements feel significant. She took the shoebox from beneath the coffee table, the complaint letters, the yellow legal pads, the stamped and returned envelopes, the tissue-wrapped photographs, and carried it to the cabinet where she kept her important documents. And she placed it there carefully among the things that needed to be preserved and accessed and used, because they were no longer just the record of something that had been done to her family. They were now evidence in a reopened file with a case number and a lieutenant's name attached to it, and investigators who had promised in writing to follow it wherever it led. Then she went to the side table near the lamp, the one with the framed photograph and the black ribbon pinned to the corner. The last picture taken 2 Sundays before they killed him, and she carried it to the windowsill that faced the street, the one where the evening light came through in the fall at a long, warm angle, and she set it there where the light could find it. Her granddaughter, Terrence's daughter, came padding in from the kitchen in her socks and looked up at the photograph and said in the direct and serious way of children who have grown up understanding that some questions matter, "Is that Daddy?" And Odessa said, "Yes, baby. That's your daddy." And she did not say anything else, because there was nothing else that needed to be said in that moment, and Terrence's face looked out at the street in the October evening light with the same expression he had worn in every photograph. Surprised mid-laugh, not finished yet. 1 week later, Maya returned to the gym. She had not decided to go back and did not have a particular reason to be there. She was not scheduled to train. Had not called ahead, was still moving carefully because of the knee, and wearing the expression of someone who had not finished processing something large and was not trying to rush the processing. Coach Renata Souza was wiping down the mat when Maya came through the door exactly as she had been the night Maya had arrived with the scarf, and she looked up and took in Maya's face, and the absence of the scarf and the way Maya was carrying herself, and she did not say anything, just continued wiping with the same patient, methodical strokes, because Renata had learned over 40 years of teaching that sometimes the right thing to give someone is simply a room that does not require them to explain themselves. Maya sat down on the edge of the mat, back straight, hands on her knees, facing the photographs on the wall, the tournament plaques, the children in 2 large Gs, the faded banner from a regional championship that had been hanging slightly crooked since 2016. The gym held the smell it always held: mats and disinfectant and old coffee. Outside Atlanta was doing what Atlanta always did, moving forward, indifferent and inexhaustible. Inside, Maya sat with the particular stillness of a person listening for something she has been afraid she would never hear again. And after a while she realized she was hearing it. The ordinary sounds of a room where nothing was about to happen to her. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning, a young black woman in a gray blazer stood on the courthouse steps with a phone in her hand, slightly lost-looking, trying to understand what she was allowed to ask for. She found the security officer at the side entrance and said something too quietly for the people nearby to hear. The officer, whose name tag read M. Webb, paused what he was doing, turned fully toward her, and answered in a voice clear and steady and unhurried enough that the 2 people waiting in line behind her could hear every word. This story is a work of fiction created for storytelling and emotional illustration. All characters, events, and situations depicted are fictional and do not represent real people or actual events.